We screamed into space and heard the echo. Part 3, Wake Up. 2532, Endeavour Station, Titan Orbit, Saturn. Buzz 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 buzz. Sue waved in the general direction of the alarm clock and with a groan rolled out of bed. When the buzzer ceased its irritating droning, she stretched and was mindful that yet another shift as an EIC employee awaited her. Sue perked up as she recalled she had been informed that a new case was coming in, though an old incomplete one still worried her. Anticipation mounted as she shuffled across the patterned shag carpet and flung open the glossy drapes. The view from her apartment never failed to inspire her. The rings of Saturn shone in a bright line across her vision, the orange fuzzy ball of its moon, Titan, obscuring a portion of its parent planet. She got dressed quickly and checked herself in the mirror. Short-cut platinum blonde hair was neat. Suit with tie, white blouse and black miniskirt. Also neat and in order. Shoes shined and no ladders in her stockings. Her name tag read Sue Knightley, Exo-Industrial Coalition, EIC, Analyst. Just another office worker in a station full of office workers within the confines of Space Station Endeavour. Sue hurried out of her one-room apartment and nodded to her unresponsive neighbors, as they too prepared to go about their business, which usually meant working for the EIC. She shouldered her way through the bustling crowds of similarly suited individuals, though the men wore trousers instead of skirts and stockings. Otherwise everyone wore the same uniform. That was not to say everyone looked the same. You could tell who were newcomers to the station by the fact that they walked with a strange bounce in their step, or were wearing exoskeleons or even water suits to aid them with the gravity of the station. Sue found the streets themselves fascinating. They had multiple layers that were open at the center, designed in such a way as to be reminiscent of an old Earth city, complete with billboards and advertising. Though why the EIC would advertise good workers being promoted to the board of directors was beyond Sue. It was true that fame and fortune accompanied any position on the board, and they were considered celebrities to rival idols, exhibited on other billboards, not that she was interested in either. Eventually, she got to the friendly but very quiet barista that poured Sue her morning fabricated coffee and gave her a bag of leftover treats. She sipped her drink tentatively as she picked her way through more crowded streets on her way to work. No one spared the time to say hello or wave or acknowledge each other. It was good manners to mind your own business, she had concluded after she had tried once or twice, but she was either ignored or got a look of such shock that she hurried off without another word. The only exception was when she stopped at an alley to feed the cats. They purred from their box and happily accepted her patting while lapping up the treats she bought from the barista each day. She couldn't dawdle at the cats for longer than a few minutes, no matter how much she wished she could. Sue nodded to the tall and lanky security guard in front of her office building before scrambling inside. Her two co-workers, Monica and Erica, as she recalled, were chatting with the secretary model Rita, or Rita as she preferred to be called. "Did you snare another one last night, Monica?" Rita teased, loving the latest news around the office, while Erica looked on sheepishly while clearly being interested in Monica's off-shift activities. "You know how it is, Rita. They can't help but adore me. What about you, Erica? Are you still playing that UVR game? Eternal World or something? Found someone of interest in there yet?" "Hyperrealistic," the review said. "Ah. Yeah. Still playing a bit," Erica nodded agreeably while turning a light shade of pink. "Not found anyone like that." "Did you hear about the explosion on the lower levels?" she added, quickly changing the topic. "Terrorists, someone said." Sue moved on quickly, leaving them to their gossip. She had tried that game they mentioned too for the express purpose of meeting that special someone. She had become a paladin and slew a few monsters. She was impressed by the high fidelity of the experience, but she found the outfits to be too revealing, and she disliked being ogled by every second adventurer. It was true that it was effectively a dating application where people went to hook up. But those clothes. It wasn't for her. After catching the fifth or sixth player drooling over her in so many minutes, she was ready to drop UVR. What finally pushed her over the edge was the final player that couldn't keep their hands to themselves. The game definitely wasn't for her, even if the advertisement said everyone could find a place, and unofficially, a partner or 5. for themselves in there. She would try another way and in the meanwhile distract herself with her mountains of work. At least her job actually meant something, unlike some virtual reality player that only wanted to get into her virtual pants. While she still pined for that special someone, unfortunately romance continued to elude her. She made it to her cubicle without any further distractions, sat down in her chair, swiveled into her desk, and put on her augmented reality glasses. AR turned the 3 blank walls of her off-white cubicle into interactive screens that showed the data of her current project as well as search consoles and many transcribed text chats with her online friends and colleagues. One had sent an adorable video of a kitten riding a duck. Too cute. She decided that her special someone would have to like kittens too. Sue closed that chat with a swipe of her hand and sipped at her coffee as she considered her old project once again. It was about discovering the reason for an accident involving hydrogen containment on an ice moon and how to prevent it happening again, but she has run out of ideas. There was simply not enough information, so she shoved it off into the corner to be considered again another time. Sue was a data analyst and proud of the work she did. Usually, the source of the data as well as names and places were redacted, replaced with codes or tokens, but sometimes she could work out where the place was from the data itself. She turned her attention to the new case. The question that accompanied the new specific set of data was who or what had been using up resources without following the proper channels and notifying their superiors. The codes, digits, and schematics danced in green light in front of her as she studied them. Sue made the exciting discovery that this data was for Devastation itself. Water, code H20DNGAN, drinkable water imported from Ganymede, and fabricated narcotics, code AN151LF, the F indicating it was fabricated and the rest giving its drug serial number, had been separately reported to be missing. Access to the fabricators themselves was strictly monitored, while storage for fabricated goods had less security. It wasn't a huge problem if something went missing out of storage, since more could be fabricated. Sue had once asked how the fabricators themselves worked and received an answer that they took energy from the station's stellar core and divided it by the square of the speed of light to produce mass. She could tell it was a joke and they weren't going to tell her how they actually functioned. As amazing as they sounded, fabricators had limits. They could only create from pre-programmed recipes and they had waiting queues, so it became inconvenient if something ran out. Emergency fabrications were a sign that someone had royally messed up and heads would roll. Drugs and water? Water and drugs. On a hunch, Sue checked the power consumption records and cross-checked the actual numbers against the expected ones. Green numbers scrolled across her walls, moving and reforming to give her a better idea of trends. Power wasn't a problem on Devastation, as it was all generated by the EIC proprietary stellar core fusion reactor. There was more than enough to power the station for eons, but the EIC still kept immaculate records. The lower decks lit up with high unreported power use. It made sense since these were where the poorer workers lived, the solars that had remained in the system before the EIC returned and gifted them with a better standard of living. They thanked the EIC by being lazy, protesting, and generally being a nuisance, at least that is what the news said. Another section in her schematic of the station showed abnormal power use. A storage room off to the side labeled as WH33LT1R3RFSTR, fabricated wheels and tire storage. Wheels tend to last on a space station with low gravity, so replacements are hardly ever needed, especially with zero-gravity chutes used throughout the station for transport to other levels. Sue brought up the numbers of that warehouse that included everything from inventory to the atmospheric conditions. Sue heard a pair strolling by her cubicle, distracting her for a moment with their conversation. Her manager, Robert, was walking by with a guest, or perhaps his boss's boss, or even his boss's boss's boss. EIC had a very tiered hierarchical system with multiple layers of middle management and the board right at the top. The CEO of EIC was likely on the very top, but Sue didn't care to find out what they actually did. She didn't even know who her boss's boss was or anyone further up the chain, she only knew she was bottom rung. EIC discouraged knowing too much and enjoyed compartmentalizing. As they strolled by, like only the uppers could afford to stroll, they chatted. "This is the analytics department. The best in this system." she heard Robert say proudly. Sue snorted. He wasn't wrong, but he had little to do with their success. Why don't you have AI do it for you? They would be much faster, the other replied. Funny you should mention that, she heard before the pair walked out of earshot. It annoyed Sue to no end that every second suggestion about her department was that they could be replaced by AI. AI was smarter. AI was faster. AI was more efficient. If that were the case, they would have been replaced a long time ago. They could go stuff there, talk about AI up there. Calm, Sue, calm down. There was no need to get worked up about it. Maybe she should find her romantic someone and move to Venus. It was said the floating cloud cities were a particularly beautiful and romantic place to live. She inhaled and exhaled slowly as she shoved away the dream and cleaned a droplet of coffee that had spilt onto her hand. Here and now, she would prove that no AI could replace her. She would investigate this anomaly herself. It was perfect. She would prove that she, the analyst, was far superior to some soulless AI. Excited to begin, she noted the location of the anomalous storage room, pulled off her AR glasses, and she stood up to leave. Removing the glasses left her momentarily disoriented, which proved disastrous as she stepped out of her cubicle and collided with someone hurrying by. The momentum carried her to the floor, but not before slamming her head against the corner of the cubicle wall, tearing out a sizable chunk of the light gray material. The world around her buzzed and distorted oddly as if she was still wearing her AR glasses before snapping back to normalcy. Sue noted the side of her head was aching as she tried to process what was happening. She could not remember when she was last injured. The tiny cut on her finger from when she was chopping vegetables? That must have been many soul cycles ago now. She blinked. Her manager's face was far too close to hers. Bulbous nose, a slight squint, and one eye seemed larger than the other. Robert was not good looking, but that wasn't what bothered Sue. It was his hands that were somehow sliding all over her. He was mouthing something of which she could only hear snippets, thought static. Sue found herself answering, "Fine. Fine. Thank you for asking," to the unheard question. She tried to push him off, but found her limbs weren't responding. Meanwhile, those hands continued to grope her through her clothes. In an instant her motor functions returned and she stood up, pushing Robert back. He seemed as surprised as she was, but he quickly recovered, muttering something else. She felt dizzy as she touched a few fingers to her temple that had taken the blow. It wasn't bleeding, at least, she thought as she checked her clean fingertips. Her boss was reaching those clasping hands towards her again as he queried, "Are you sure you are fine? You should take the rest of your shift off and go have yourself checked." Sue nodded her thanks, turned and strode as well as she could out of their office, still feeling dizzy. A thought came to her as she left. Hadn't her boss been a handsome man that Monica and Erica both swooned over? Perhaps she was remembering incorrectly. The corridor to the office entrance seemed darker than usual, a darker shade of grey, but Sue dismissed it as her imagination. What she knew wasn't her imagination was the large security guard standing at the entrance. On top of his very human head he had pointed wolf-like ears covered in reddish-brown fur. At least he didn't have both human and wolf ears. That would have been weird. The security guard noticed her looking and grinned at her, showing elongated canines. Though he was still as lean, tall and athletically muscled as she remembered. What she didn't remember was his large bushy reddish-brown tail that swished behind him back and forth. And what big hands! Sue dragged her eyes away and continued walking. She was more of a cat person. 2532, Sue's apartment, Endeavor Station. Buzz 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 buzz. Sue woke up groggily, shutting the alarm up with a wave of her hand, but she miscalculated the distance and smashed her hand on the clock, sweeping it off its table and into the wall where it proceeded to shatter into multiple pieces. Sue ignored her accident as she had a more urgent problem occupying her thoughts. She couldn't remember how she had gotten home and she was still in her work clothes. The knock on the head must have been worse than she had thought, and it would be wise to go to a doctor. But on the other hand, there was that storage room she wanted to have a look into. Sue blinked as she sat up. She was sure her apartment had been brighter before, better lit. It seemed dingy by comparison. The pot plant in the corner had been bright and lush yesterday, but today appeared drab and fake. Everything was in its place, but it didn't appear as new or looked after. She couldn't quite place it, but it looked like everything had been replaced with a cheaper version of itself. Sue went to the window and pulled back the flimsy curtains, expecting to see a spectacular view of the orange ball of Titan with the rings of Saturn in the background, but instead there was only a blank grey wall. Maybe she had mistaken the window for a display all this time, and the display happened to be as broken as her alarm clock. Sue shook her head. She wasn't so self-delusional. Something had changed, and by logical reasoning, if everything around her changed, then it was most likely that the world around her hadn't changed, but her own perception of it had changed. Sue pinched the rough sheets on the bed. These sheets had been silky smooth before. But why would someone do something like this? Why would someone make her think that she was surrounded by comfortable opulence when she wasn't? To what end? To make money from happy employees while spending as little as possible. It began to make sense. Even with fabricators, everything cost credits. Why fabricate new goods when old used ones could be used instead? For a single individual, the difference wouldn't be much, but multiply that by the few million that lived in the station. The savings would add up to a tremendous amount. And all it took was a little chip in the brain similar to the ones used for VR. Virtual reality was so prolific, she would guess that the chips would be incredibly cheap to manufacture. Sue paced over the once luxuriously thick rug, now a sad thinning cloth with a completely different hideous faded pattern. What would she do now that the facade had been ripped off her world? After a few moments, she came to the only conclusion: nothing. She could do nothing. EIC would chip her up again and, maybe worse, dispose of her altogether. She would pretend it was all still fine and continue her shifts as usual. She had to act like she would normally act. However, 2532, Storage Unit WH33LT1R3, in devastation. Sue cussed at herself under her own breath. Her curiosity had gotten the better of her, and now she was right outside the suspicious storage room. It had been easy enough to get here, even if it was bewildering. The quick walk from her apartment to the nearest zero-gravity chute was littered with unfamiliar sights. The suited humans in the bustling streets were mostly humans, but some had become robots, like her coffee barista. Others had insectoid features while still walking upright. Some in hydration suits appeared more like jelly people than humans. Most in the street still wore suits and ties, though. Apparently it was fashionable. While the layout of the streets themselves were the same, they were not as well lit, and the advertisements were also different, less tailored to what she might find interesting. The cats! Before she continued to the lower levels, she walked by the cats in the alley, and thankfully they were the same cute creatures she remembered them to be. The cats were safe, and she quickly went to the zero-grave chute, grabbed the levitation handle, and rode it to the correct floor. From there it was a few twists and turns down dreary corridors later, and she stood before the slightly rusted door to the storage space in question. She could turn back now and forget about this silly idea. She wasn't an investigator, and EIC didn't take kindly to employees acting beyond their designated roles, but she had to know. She put a hand on the door handle, twisted it and pulled. Nothing. She pushed, and the door swung open with the loudest squeak she had ever heard a door make. Her heart thumped wildly as she opened it the rest of the way and looked in. The lights from the corridor illuminated the nearest pile of tires, but the room beyond was cloaked in darkness. Sue had come prepared and pulled out a tiny flashlight, no larger than her pinky, and shone its beam of light into the storage facility. More tires, piled on top of each other in neat towers. She listened and heard a faint dripping and chugging noise. The air felt damp and had a smell of rubber mixed with something wet and organic with a hint of rust. She began to walk between the columns of tires, the tiny flashlight making shadows jump and move around her as she waggled it around. The air was getting warmer and more humid as she progressed. She was going in the correct direction. Turning a corner, she stopped short as her light fell on a pile of what looked like debris, but nestled in the center was a clutch of pale green eggs, each larger than her first. They were all covered with sticky green mucus that dripped with moisture. Droplets fell from above and she turned her light upwards. A contraption hummed against the ceiling. Steam and water vapor swirled out from haphazardly placed tubes, and one was dripping a liquid directly onto the eggs below. Sue caught a droplet in her palm and then shook it free. It was warm and sticky. Someone had set up the machine to be a crude incubator that provided the eggs with both moisture and heat. Then the lights in the warehouse suddenly flickered on, causing Sue to nearly scream. "I know you are in here." A female voice called with a sing-along melody that sent a shiver down Sue's spine. Sue, thinking quickly, covered her own mouth, almost gagging at the smell the droplet left on her hand. Ensuring she wouldn't let out a peep, she tucked away her tiny flashlight and hid behind a column of tires. "Where are you?" Another hauntingly melodic call made Sue shuffle deeper into her hiding place, her heart thumping. Was this the one incubating the eggs? Their mother? What kind of horrifying creature could it be? Sue thought back to the wolfman. Something worse than that? "Found you!" The voice sang and Sue closed her eyes, preparing herself for the worst. But instead of being grabbed, she heard squelching popping noises. Sue risked peeking out from behind her tires to see a very human woman in blue workman clothes gleefully stomping on the eggs, each oozing out a small green embryo with a sickening squelch. Green muck splattered the surroundings and the woman as she continued to stomp. Then Sue recognized her. She was the one that made Sue quit UVR. The player that got very handsy with the excuse of adjusting Sue's armor that showed more skin than it covered. Magic, she had told her. The armor was enchanted to provide a magical protection. Sue couldn't follow her logic at all. It all seemed like excuses to make Sue bare more skin. A nearby tire decided this was the moment to become dislodged and slide off its pile, bouncing to a muffled stop right next to Sue. Sue cursed quietly at her luck as she tried to shift into a better hiding place, but she knew it was too late. The squelching had stopped. Only an eerie drip and hum of the makeshift incubator could be heard. Sensing something, Sue looked up and found a familiar face surrounded by dark hair grinning back at her. "Saintus," Sue said before a tire clouted Sue on the side of her head in the same place she had been struck before. Sue's vision went dark. Thank you for listening to Part 3. If you would like to hear Part 4 of this story, add a like and comment. Your support is greatly appreciated.